Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. This all happened back when I was 16 years old. I'm 21 now, but I've never shared this with anyone before. The memories still make my hands shake when I think about that night in the Louisiana Bayou country. Back in 2018, my family and I have always been active hunters, and we do it every year during the appropriate seasons. We harvest our normal game: deer, rabbit, squirrel, wild boar, and I've always been the one who specializes in hunting the feral hogs that tear up our family's land. The best time to hunt hogs is at night, and it's perfectly legal in our state with the proper licenses. These weren't just any ordinary pigs. The feral hogs in our area had grown massive and aggressive over the years, some weighing over 300 pounds with razor-sharp tusks that could rip a man's leg clean off. They traveled in groups called sounders, destroying crops and endangering livestock. My grandfather's stories about hunters getting charged by wounded boars had always given me a healthy respect for these dangerous animals. Our hunting blind sat elevated about 12 feet off the ground, positioned strategically overlooking a natural clearing where we'd scatter corn to attract the hogs. The blind was constructed from weathered plywood and had shooting ports cut into the walls, providing 360-degree visibility while keeping us concealed. My father and grandfather had built it years ago, and the wood had aged to a dark gray that blended seamlessly with the surrounding oak and cypress trees. That particular evening in October, the air hung thick with humidity and the musty smell of decaying leaves. Spanish moss draped from the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the occasional splash of something large moving through the swamp water. The temperature had dropped just enough to make sitting still comfortable, and there was barely any wind. Perfect conditions for hunting. I'd been using my grandfather's lever-action .45-70 rifle, a powerful weapon capable of dropping even the largest hog with a single well-placed shot. The rifle held 7 rounds in its tubular magazine, and I always kept one in the chamber when I was in the blind. Attached to the rifle was a high-quality night vision scope that turned the darkness into an eerie green-tinted world, allowing me to see clearly up to 200 yards even on the blackest nights. I settled into the blind around 8 p.m., just as the last traces of daylight were fading from the western sky. The routine was always the same: check my equipment, load the rifle, adjust the scope, and then wait. Patience was the most important skill any hunter could develop, and I'd learned to appreciate the quiet solitude of these evening vigils. For the first hour, nothing moved except the occasional bat flitting overhead, and a family of armadillos shuffling through the underbrush about 50 yards to my left. The night sounds were exactly what I expected: the distant hooting of a great horned owl, the rhythmic chirping of crickets, and somewhere far off, the haunting call of a screech owl that sounded almost human in its intensity. Around 9:30, I spotted movement near the corn pile. Through my scope, I could make out a young doe picking her way carefully toward the scattered feed. She was beautiful, maybe 80 pounds, with a sleek reddish-brown coat that gleamed in the artificial green light of my night vision. She fed peacefully for several minutes, constantly alert, ears swiveling at every small sound. Soon she was joined by 3 raccoons, their distinctive masked faces clearly visible through the scope. They were bold little creatures, completely unafraid of the much larger deer. I watched them for about 15 minutes, entertained by their almost human-like hands as they picked through the corn. The doe eventually wandered off toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of our property, but the raccoons continued their feast. The creek was an important feature of our hunting setup. It ran about 6 or 7 feet deep through a natural channel, with steep banks on both sides. We essentially used it as a natural backstop for our fired rounds in case a bullet passed completely through an animal. The water was usually clear enough to see the bottom during the day, fed by a spring somewhere upstream, and it provided drinking water for all the local wildlife. I was starting to relax, thinking it might be a quiet night with just deer and small game, when everything changed in an instant. It happened so suddenly that it took my brain several seconds to process what was wrong. The raccoons, which had been chattering and rustling through the corn just moments before, stopped eating and looked up simultaneously. Their heads all turned toward the same spot near the creek, and I could see their bodies tense with alarm. Then, Without any apparent signal, all three of them scattered into the darkness, moving faster than I'd ever seen raccoons move. The cricket chorus, which had been providing a constant background soundtrack to the evening, stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. The owl that had been calling intermittently went silent. Even the distant sounds of frogs from the swamp seemed to fade away until there was absolutely nothing. No sound at all except for my own breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. This was wrong. Completely wrong. In all my years of hunting, I'd never experienced silence this absolute. There's always something making noise in the woods, wind through leaves, small animals moving, insects buzzing. But this was like being inside a vacuum, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I gripped my rifle tighter and began scanning the area through my scope, moving slowly from left to right across the clearing and into the tree line. The green-tinted world of night vision revealed nothing unusual at first, just the familiar landscape of moss-draped trees and tangled underbrush. But the longer the silence lasted, the more convinced I became that something was watching me. My heart started beating faster, and I could feel sweat beginning to form on my forehead despite the cool evening air. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any sound that might explain what had frightened away all the wildlife. Minutes passed like hours, and the unnatural quiet continued. That's when I remembered my grandfather's stories about how animals could sense things that humans couldn't. Changes in air pressure before storms, the presence of predators, even earthquakes hours before they happened. Whatever had caused this reaction in the local wildlife was something they perceived as a serious threat. I was scanning the creek area with my scope when I saw them. Two bright points of light reflecting back at me from near the water's edge. My pulse quickened with excitement. Eye shine. It had to be a hog coming for a drink before heading to the corn pile. I'd been hoping for this all evening. I adjusted my position in the blind, bringing the rifle up to my shoulder and settling into a proper shooting stance. Through the scope, I could see the reflection clearly now. Definitely eye shine, positioned about the right height for a large boar. The corn was scattered in an open area with a clear shot, and if I could get this animal to move toward the bait, I'd have an easy 75-yard shot. But something was off about what I was seeing. The eye shine was positioned strangely, and as I watched, trying to make out the shape of the animal's body, I realized the eyes were moving in a way that didn't make sense for a hog. They were too high off the ground, and they seemed to be moving upward, as if whatever I was looking at was climbing. I adjusted the focus on my scope, trying to get a clearer image. What I saw next made absolutely no sense at all. The creature, and I had to call it that because I couldn't identify what I was looking at, appeared to be climbing up the steep bank of the creek, using what looked like hands and arms. Not hooves, not paws, but actual hands gripping the roots and rocks along the bank. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a black bear? We didn't have many in our area, but they weren't completely unknown. Bears could climb and had somewhat human-like front paws, but the size was wrong, and bears didn't move like this. This thing was climbing with a purpose and coordination that seemed too deliberate, too intelligent. As I watched in growing confusion and fear, the creature reached the top of the creek bank and stood upright. It was definitely bipedal, walking on two legs like a human, but it was covered in dark hair or fur from head to toe. The body was powerfully built, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past where a human's arms would end. My hands began to tremble as the full implication of what I was seeing hit me. This wasn't any animal I'd ever studied or heard about. This was something that shouldn't exist. Yet here it was, walking casually toward our corn pile as if it owned the place. The creature moved with a confidence that was absolutely terrifying. It didn't skulk or sneak like a wild animal approaching potential danger. It walked upright with the bearing of something that had no natural predators, something that was used to being at the top of the food chain. Through my night vision scope, I could see details that my rational mind refused to accept. The thing stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with a humanoid shape but proportions that were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its shoulders too broad, and its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders without much of a neck. The entire body was covered in dark, coarse-looking hair, and when it turned slightly, I could see that its face was a horrible mixture of human and ape-like features. But what scared me most was the intelligence I could see in its movements. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. It examined the corn pile methodically, picking up individual kernels and sniffing them before eating. It looked around the clearing as if taking inventory, and at one point it turned its head directly toward my blind. For a moment that lasted an eternity, I was convinced it was looking right at me. Even though I knew I was well concealed and 12 feet up in the air, I felt completely exposed and vulnerable. The thing tilted its head slightly, as if listening for sounds I couldn't hear, then went back to feeding. My grandfather had always taught me that fear was the enemy of good shooting. Control your breathing, steady your hands. Make the shot count, he'd always said. But nothing in my 16 years of life had prepared me for this moment. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the crosshairs steady, and my heart was pounding so hard I was afraid the sound might give away my position. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just a person, a homeless individual living rough in the woods, covered in hair because they hadn't bathed in months. But even as I thought it, I knew that explanation didn't fit. No human moved like this, and no human could have climbed that creek bank with such ease. The creature finished eating and started to move away from the corn pile, heading back toward the creek. In a few seconds, it would disappear into the darkness, and I'd be left wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. That's when I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Despite every instinct screaming at me to remain hidden and let the thing leave peacefully, I found myself raising the rifle and settling into shooting position. Maybe it was the recklessness of youth, or maybe I was so terrified that I couldn't think straight, but I convinced myself that I needed to take action. If this was some kind of dangerous animal, it could threaten my family's property or even attack someone. I centered the crosshairs on the creature's chest, trying to compensate for my shaking hands. The 45-70 was a powerful cartridge, capable of dropping a buffalo, and at this range, it should stop whatever this thing was. I controlled my breathing the way my grandfather had taught me, taking a deep breath, letting half of it out, then holding steady. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, and for a split second it turned back toward my blind. In the green glow of my night vision scope, I could see its face clearly, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. There was unmistakable intelligence in those eyes, and something else that looked almost like recognition, as if it knew exactly where I was and what I was planning to do. But I was too committed to the shot to stop now. I squeezed the trigger slowly and steadily, the way I'd been taught. The rifle erupted with a deafening roar that shattered the unnatural silence of the night. The muzzle flash temporarily blinded my night vision, and the recoil drove the stock hard into my shoulder. My ears were ringing from the gunshot, but over that ringing I heard something that made my spine go rigid with terror. It was a roar, not the angry bellow of a wounded hog or the growl of a bear, but something primal and alien that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. The sound was so loud and so full of rage that I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through my bones. When my night vision cleared, I looked through the scope again and saw nothing. The clearing was empty except for the scattered corn and the lingering smoke from my rifle. Whatever I'd shot at was gone, vanished as quickly and silently as it had appeared. I sat in the blind for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might attract the creature's attention. The ringing in my ears gradually faded, but the normal night sounds didn't return. The woods remained eerily quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky with pale orange light, I worked up the courage to leave the blind and investigate what damage I might have done. My legs were stiff from sitting motionless for so long, and my hands were still shaking from a combination of adrenaline and fear that had never quite faded. I loaded a fresh cartridge into the chamber of my rifle and made my way carefully down from the blind. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide potential danger, and I found myself jumping at the slightest sound. A squirrel chattering overhead, a woodpecker hammering against dead wood somewhere in the distance. The corn pile showed clear evidence of disturbance. The kernels were scattered in patterns that didn't match the neat feeding habits of deer or the random digging of hogs. Whatever had been here had picked through the corn methodically, almost intelligently, but more disturbing were the footprints in the soft earth around the pile. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Large, at least 16 inches long, and vaguely human-shaped but with toes that were too long and a width that was completely wrong for any person. The impressions were deep, suggesting something much heavier than a normal human, and the stride length between prints indicated a creature with legs longer than any man I'd ever known. Following the prints, I could see where the creature had approached from the creek and where it had fled after my shot. The trail led back toward the water, but there was something else, dark spots on the ground that looked suspiciously like blood. My shot had connected. I followed the blood trail with growing trepidation. Each drop seemed to mock my decision to shoot. Evidence that I'd wounded something I didn't understand. The spots led down to the creek bank, across the shallow water, and up the other side. For 2 hours I tracked the trail through increasingly dense undergrowth, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for sounds that might indicate the creature was nearby. The blood spots were getting smaller and farther apart, suggesting that whatever I'd hit wasn't critically wounded. That thought should have been reassuring, but instead, it filled me with dread. If I'd wounded this thing and it was still alive, what would it do? Would it come looking for revenge? That's when I heard the roar again. The sound came from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the woods where the undergrowth grew thick and the canopy blocked out most of the morning sunlight. It was the same primal bellow I'd heard after my shot, but this time it was different. Louder, angrier, and much closer than I was comfortable with. Before I could react, I heard something else that made my blood run cold. The sound of something heavy hitting the ground nearby. Then another impact, and another. Something was throwing objects at me. Not just any objects, but rocks. Big ones, judging by the sound they made when they hit the trees around me. A boulder the size of a basketball crashed through the branches about 10 feet to my left, hitting the ground with enough force to shake the earth under my feet. Another one whistled past my head so close I could feel the wind from its passage. These weren't random throws. They were aimed, deliberate, and coming from something with incredible strength and accuracy. I turned and ran. All thoughts of tracking or investigation fled from my mind as pure survival instinct took over. Behind me, I could hear more rocks crashing through the forest, some hitting trees with sounds like gunshots, others striking the ground with dull thuds that spoke of tremendous impact force. The creature was following me, pacing me through the woods, continuing its bombardment as I fled. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, not crashing through like a panicked animal, but moving with purpose and coordination that was absolutely terrifying. It was hurting me, driving me away from its territory with calculated precision. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I ran, but I didn't dare slow down. A rock the size of a softball struck a tree trunk just inches from my head, sending bark fragments flying. Another one hit the ground so close to my feet that dirt and debris scattered across my legs. It took me nearly an hour of desperate flight to reach the edge of our property and the safety of open fields. When I finally stopped running, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. I turned back toward the woods one last time, expecting to see my pursuer emerging from the tree line, but there was nothing. The forest looked peaceful and normal in the morning light, giving no hint of the terror I'd just experienced. But I knew something was watching me from the shadows. I could feel its eyes on me, intelligent and patient, as if it was memorizing my face for future reference. The message was clear. I had trespassed in its domain, wounded it, and been found wanting. I was being allowed to leave this time, but that mercy might not extend to a second encounter. I still hunt, but everything changed that day. I traded my grandfather's .45-70 for an AR-15 with a 30-round magazine, and I never hunt alone anymore. Most importantly, I never hunt at night. Some boundaries once crossed should never be tested again. The official story I told my family was that I'd spotted what I thought was a large black bear and missed my shot. The blood trail, I claimed, must have been from a deer I hadn't seen. Nobody questioned my story, and I never shared the truth of what really happened in those woods. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still hear that roar in my dreams, and I know with absolute certainty that somewhere in the deep woods of Louisiana, something remembers the night a foolish young hunter dared to take a shot at the unknown. God help me, I hope our paths never cross again. Growing up in rural Utah during the summer of 2018, I had just turned 14 and felt invincible. Our family owned 43 acres of rugged terrain that backed up against thousands of acres of national forest land. The property had been in our family for 3 generations, and every tree, every rock formation, every hidden creek bed was as familiar to me as the freckles on my arms. My parents both worked long shifts at the copper mine about 20 miles south of our property. Dad left before dawn, and Mom followed an hour later, leaving me with a list of chores and strict instructions to stay within shouting distance of the house. But that summer, with the oppressive heat and the endless days stretching before me, those instructions became more like suggestions I chose to ignore. The isolation never bothered me before. Our nearest neighbor lived 4 miles away, and the silence of the wilderness felt comforting rather than threatening. I'd grown up with the sounds of coyotes howling at dusk, the crash of elk moving through the underbrush, and the rustle of smaller creatures scurrying through fallen leaves. These were the sounds of home. My routine that summer involved completing my chores by mid-morning, then spending the hottest part of the day exploring. I had discovered old mining claims scattered throughout the forest, rusted equipment left behind from the silver rush of the early 1900s. There were also Native American petroglyphs carved into sandstone cliffs, and hidden pools fed by underground springs where the water stayed cold even in July. But my favorite destination was my maternal grandparents' property, located about 1.5 miles through the densest part of our forest. Their small ranch house sat in a cleared meadow, and Grandma Rose always had fresh-baked cookies cooling on the kitchen counter. The hike there took me through terrain that shifted from high desert scrub to dense pine forest, across 2 seasonal creek beds, and up a steep rocky incline that always left me breathless. The path I'd worn over the years wound between massive Douglas fir trees, some of them easily 200 years old. Their trunks were so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. The canopy they created blocked out most of the harsh Utah sun, creating a natural air conditioning system that made the forest floor cool and inviting, even during the hottest summer days. I knew every landmark along the way, the lightning-split oak tree that served as my halfway marker, the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear where I sometimes rested, and the small clearing where wild strawberries grew in late June. This knowledge gave me confidence, perhaps too much confidence, as I would later learn. The first sign that something had changed came during the last week of June. I was making my usual afternoon trek to visit Grandma Rose when I noticed the forest had grown unusually quiet. At first, I attributed it to the heat wave that had settled over central Utah, pushing temperatures well above normal for that time of year. Animals often became less active during extreme heat, seeking shade and conserving energy. But this silence felt different, more complete somehow. Usually, even during the hottest days, I could hear the steady percussion of woodpeckers working dead trees, the chatter of squirrels defending their territories, or the rustle of chipmunks darting through the underbrush. Now there was nothing except the sound of my own footsteps crackling through dried pine needles and fallen leaves. The trees themselves seemed to lean inward, creating darker shadows than I remembered. Patches of sunlight that once dappled the forest floor appeared smaller, more scattered. Even the air felt heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake off the unease that was building in my chest. After all, I'd walked this path hundreds of times over the years. I knew every root that jutted up to catch an unwary foot, every low-hanging branch that might snag a backpack. The forest was my domain, my sanctuary. Nothing here could hurt me. But the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each step. The normal landmarks seemed slightly off, as if someone had moved them just a few inches when I wasn't looking. The lightning-split oak appeared more twisted, its dead branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The bear-shaped boulder cast a shadow that looked less like a sleeping animal and more like a crouched predator ready to pounce. Even the familiar sense of the forest seemed muted. The rich smell of decomposing leaves, the fresh pine fragrance that usually filled my nostrils, the earthy aroma of damp soil near the creek beds. All of it was faded, as if someone had sucked the life out of the very air I was breathing. By the time I reached the small clearing where wild strawberries grew, my hands were clammy with perspiration that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The berry patch, which should have been heavy with ripe fruit, was withered and brown. The plants looked as if they'd been hit by frost, despite the sweltering heat that had dominated the weather for weeks. I stood at the edge of that dying clearing for several minutes, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around and go home. But teenage pride and stubborn curiosity won out over common sense. I convinced myself that I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild over what was probably just a natural dry spell affecting the local wildlife. I pressed onward through the increasingly oppressive forest, determined to reach my grandparents' house before whatever was causing my unease could manifest into something real. The temperature had begun to drop noticeably, and when I looked up through the canopy, I could see thick, dark clouds building on the western horizon. Utah summer storms could be violent and unpredictable, rolling in with little warning and unleashing torrents of rain, hail, and dangerous lightning. The high elevation and rocky terrain created perfect conditions for flash floods, and I'd seen firsthand how quickly dry creek beds could become raging rivers. The wind began to pick up, causing the massive pines to sway and groan. The sound was different from anything I'd heard before, not the usual whisper of air moving through branches, but something deeper, more menacing. It was as if the trees themselves were voicing their distress, warning me to seek shelter immediately. I quickened my pace, no longer taking time to appreciate the natural beauty around me. My focus narrowed to the path ahead, and the increasingly urgent need to reach safety. The storm clouds were building with unnatural speed, turning the sky from blue to gray to an ominous green-black that made my stomach clench with fear. The first raindrops began to fall just as I passed the bear-shaped boulder. They were huge, heavy droplets that struck the ground with audible impacts, sending up small puffs of dust from the drought-hardened earth. Within minutes, the sporadic drops became a steady spattering, then a proper downpour that soaked through my t-shirt and jeans. Thunder rumbled overhead, starting as a distant growl but quickly becoming a bone-deep vibration that I could feel in my chest. The lightning wasn't far behind, brilliant white flashes that illuminated the forest in stark, momentary detail before plunging everything back into premature twilight. I pulled the hood of my jacket over my head and hunched my shoulders against the driving rain. The familiar path was becoming treacherous as the dry earth turned to slippery mud. Roots and rocks that I'd stepped over safely thousands of times now became hazards that threatened to send me tumbling face first into the muck. The storm's intensity increased with every passing minute. What had started as large, scattered raindrops became sheets of water that hammered down through the forest canopy. The wind whipped the trees into a frenzied dance, and I could hear the sharp crack of branches snapping under the strain. Lightning struck somewhere nearby, the flash so bright it left purple afterimages dancing in my vision. The thunder that followed was instantaneous, an explosive crack that made my ears ring. The acrid smell of ozone and burned wood filled the air, mixing with the sense of wet earth and vegetation. I was still at least half a mile from my grandparents' house when I realized this wasn't just a normal summer storm. The violence of the weather, the way it had appeared so suddenly, the almost supernatural darkness that seemed to be pressing down on the forest, none of it felt natural. I was struggling through ankle-deep mud, using tree trunks for support and trying to keep my footing on the increasingly treacherous path when I heard it for the first time. It started as a low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up despite the cold rain soaking through my clothes. The moan built in intensity, rising and falling like some sort of primitive musical instrument played by an insane musician. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the roar of a mountain lion. Both sounds I'd heard many times before. This was something else entirely, something that my brain couldn't categorize or explain. I stopped moving and pressed my back against the rough bark of a massive pine tree, trying to pinpoint the direction the sound was coming from. But the acoustics of the storm-lashed forest made it impossible to locate the source. The wailing seemed to bounce off tree trunks and rock formations, creating an echo effect that made it sound like multiple sources surrounding me. My heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every rational part of my mind was trying to explain away what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the wind moving through a rock formation in an unusual way. Maybe a tree had fallen and was rubbing against another tree, creating that horrible moaning sound. Maybe it was an injured animal, something large that had been caught in the storm. But deep in my gut, in that primitive part of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive for millions of years, I knew this wasn't any of those things. This was something else, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist in the safe, familiar forest I'd explored my entire life. The wailing stopped abruptly, leaving only the sounds of rain and wind, and my own ragged breathing. I waited, pressed against that tree trunk, counting my heartbeats and straining to hear anything that might give me a clue about what was out there. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Then I saw the light. It appeared between the trees about 50 yards away. A pale, flickering glow that bobbed and weaved as if someone was carrying a lantern through the forest. My first reaction was relief. Another person, probably my grandfather, coming to look for me in the storm. I opened my mouth to call out, to let him know where I was. But something stopped me. The light was moving wrong, swaying too erratically to be carried by a person walking. It would disappear behind one tree trunk, then reappear much closer than it should have been, as if it was moving faster than human walking speed. Sometimes it seemed to be at ground level, sometimes higher up, as if floating through the air. The moaning started again, and this time I could tell it was coming from the direction of the light. The sound was clearer now, less distorted by distance and the storm. It wasn't the cry of any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost human-like in its cadence, but there was something fundamentally wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. I realized I was holding my breath, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, to get away from whatever was making that horrible sound and carrying that impossible light. But my legs felt like they were made of lead, and my rational mind was still trying to process what I was experiencing. The light was getting closer. Terror finally broke through my paralysis when the wailing came again, so much closer that I could feel it vibrating in my bones. I pushed myself away from the tree trunk and began to run, abandoning the familiar path and crashing through the underbrush in whatever direction seemed to lead away from that approaching light. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my face as I stumbled through the darkness. The storm had turned the forest floor into a treacherous obstacle course of slippery roots, hidden rocks and mud-filled depressions that threatened to twist my ankle with every step. Rain continued to pour down through the canopy, turning everything into a gray, watery blur. Behind me, the wailing continued, sometimes seeming to fade as I put distance between myself and the source, then returning with renewed intensity as if the thing was keeping pace with me. The light appeared and disappeared between the trees, sometimes visible from the corner of my eye, sometimes seeming to be right on top of me before vanishing again. I had no idea which direction I was heading. The familiar landmarks that usually guided me through the forest were invisible in the storm and darkness. I was running purely on adrenaline and panic, pushing deeper into territory I'd never explored, into sections of the national forest that were wild and unmapped. The terrain began to change as I fled. The gentle slopes and well-spaced trees of the area near my grandparents' property gave way to steeper inclines and dense thickets of scrub oak and juniper. I was moving into higher elevation, into country that was rougher and less forgiving. My lungs burned as I struggled up an increasingly steep slope, my feet sliding backward in the mud with each step. The wailing behind me seemed to be getting closer, more urgent, as if whatever was making that sound was becoming frustrated by the chase. The tone had changed from mournful to angry, and there was something in that change that filled me with an even deeper terror. Lightning struck a tree somewhere nearby, the crack of splitting wood so close I could smell the smoke and feel the static electricity in the air. For a moment, the entire forest was illuminated in stark detail, and I caught a glimpse of what lay ahead, a wall of red sandstone rising up into the darkness, broken by narrow canyons and crevices. I was entering the Badlands, the section of the national forest where the geology shifted from forest to desert, where centuries of erosion had carved the landscape into a maze of slot canyons and towering rock formations. It was beautiful country, but dangerous, especially in a storm. Flash floods could turn any of those narrow canyons into death traps in a matter of minutes. But I couldn't stop running. The thing behind me, whatever it was, seemed to be gaining ground. The light was visible more frequently now, and the wailing had taken on an almost triumphant quality that made my blood freeze. I was being hunted, and my pursuer was enjoying the chase. I reached the base of the sandstone wall just as another lightning strike illuminated the area. There, carved into the rock face about 20 feet to my right, was the dark mouth of a cave or crevice. Without hesitation, I scrambled toward it, my hands scraping against the rough stone as I pulled myself up the steep slope. The opening in the rock face was larger than it had appeared from a distance, wide enough for me to squeeze through sideways, and tall enough that I didn't have to duck once I was inside. The cave extended back into the sandstone for what looked like 15 or 20 feet before narrowing to a crack too small for a human to navigate. I pressed myself against the back wall and tried to control my breathing, which was coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the stone walls. The cave provided shelter from the storm, but it also trapped me. If whatever was pursuing me found the entrance, I would have nowhere to go. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but the sounds were muffled by the surrounding rock. I could still hear the wind and the drumming of rain, but they seemed distant now, almost peaceful compared to the terror I'd experienced in the forest. For the first time since I'd heard that initial wailing, I felt relatively safe. That feeling didn't last long. The moaning started again, much closer than before. It seemed to be coming from directly outside the cave entrance, and it had changed again. The angry, frustrated tone was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost pleased, as if my pursuer had found exactly what it was looking for. I held my breath and pressed myself deeper into the shadows at the back of the cave. Through the entrance I could see the pale light flickering back and forth, casting weird shadows on the opposite wall of the narrow canyon. Whatever was out there was taking its time now, no longer rushing through the forest but moving with deliberate purpose. The light paused directly in front of the cave entrance, and for a horrible moment I thought I was trapped. But then it moved on, continuing down the canyon, and the wailing began to fade. I waited, counting to 100, then 200, before I dared to move closer to the entrance and peer outside. The storm was beginning to weaken. The rain had decreased from a torrential downpour to a steady shower, and the wind was no longer whipping the trees into a frenzy. But the darkness remained absolute, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the bizarre landscape of eroded rock formations. I settled back against the cave wall and tried to figure out what to do next. I was lost, soaked to the skin, and miles from home in terrain I didn't recognize. My grandparents would be worried when I didn't show up, and my parents would be frantic when they returned from work to find me missing. But venturing back into the forest while that thing was still out there seemed like suicide. The smart thing to do was wait for daylight. Whatever was hunting me seemed to prefer the darkness and the storm. Maybe when the sun came up I could find my way home safely. Maybe the thing would retreat to wherever it had come from, leaving me free to navigate back to familiar territory. But as the hours dragged by, sleep became impossible. Every sound from outside the cave, the drip of water from the stone ceiling, the rustle of wind through the canyon, the distant howl of a genuine coyote, made me jump and strain my ears for that horrible wailing. Several times I was sure I could see that pale light flickering somewhere in the distance, but it might have been my imagination playing tricks on me. The temperature in the cave dropped steadily as the night wore on, and my wet clothes provided no protection against the cold. I hugged my knees to my chest and tried to conserve body heat, but by midnight I was shivering uncontrollably. The combination of terror, exhaustion, and hypothermia was beginning to take its toll. Time seemed to crawl as I huddled in that stone sanctuary, listening to the storm gradually weaken outside. My watch had stopped working, probably damaged by the rain or the impact of my headlong flight through the forest, so I had no way to tell how long I'd been trapped in the cave. It felt like days, but my rational mind knew it could only have been a few hours. The worst part was the waiting, the not knowing if the thing that had pursued me was still out there, still hunting. Several times throughout the night I thought I heard that horrible wailing in the distance, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the canyons. But it was faint, distorted by the rock formations, and I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my terrified imagination conjuring sounds from the natural acoustics of the storm. As the hours passed, I began to second-guess everything that had happened. Had I really seen that impossible light moving through the forest? Had something actually been chasing me? Or had I simply panicked during the storm, and run blindly through the woods until I'd gotten myself thoroughly lost? The rational part of my mind wanted to believe it had all been a product of fear and darkness, and the disorienting effects of the violent weather. But my body knew better. The scratches on my face and arms from thorns and branches were real enough. The mud caked on my clothes and the exhaustion that had settled into my bones were evidence that my flight through the forest had been genuine, even if I couldn't quite believe the reason for it. The cold was becoming a serious problem. My core temperature was dropping, and I was developing the early stages of hypothermia. My thoughts were becoming sluggish, and I had to fight the urge to curl up on the cave floor and go to sleep. I knew that if I lost consciousness in these conditions, I might not wake up. I forced myself to stay active, doing jumping jacks and push-ups in the confined space of the cave, anything to get my blood flowing and generate some body heat. The exercise also helped keep my mind occupied, preventing it from dwelling on the terror of the night, or the very real possibility that I might not survive until morning. Somewhere around what I guessed was 3 or 4 in the morning, the rain finally stopped. The sudden absence of that constant drumming sound was almost as unsettling as the storm itself had been. Now I could hear every small noise from the canyon outside, the drip of water from rock formations, The rustle of small animals moving through the brush, the distant splash of a stream that had probably been created by runoff from the storm. But I didn't hear the wailing anymore. Whatever had been out there seemed to have moved on, leaving me alone in the darkness with only my fears for company. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with a different kind of dread. Where had it gone? Was it waiting somewhere nearby for me to The silence stretched on, broken only by natural sounds that gradually became more frequent as the storm's violence faded. I could hear insects beginning to chirp, the distant call of an owl, the splash and gurgle of water moving through the canyon. Life was returning to normal, as if the terror of the previous hours had never happened. But I knew I would never be the same. Something had changed in that forest. Some boundary had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The safe, familiar wilderness of my childhood was gone forever, replaced by a place where impossible things could hunt you through the darkness and drive you to hide in holes in the ground like a frightened animal. The first hints of dawn came as a gradual lightening of the darkness at the cave entrance. The black void outside slowly shifted to deep purple, then to gray, then to the pale gold of early morning sunlight slanting through the canyon. I had never been so grateful to see the sun in my entire life. As visibility improved, I could see that I was indeed far from home, in a section of the Badlands that I'd never explored before. The canyon walls rose up on either side of me in fantastic formations of red and orange sandstone, carved by millions of years of wind and water into shapes that looked almost architectural in their complexity. A small stream ran along the canyon floor, swollen by the previous night's rain but not deep enough to pose any danger. The water was crystal clear, and I cupped my hands to drink, the cold liquid providing the first comfort I'd felt since the nightmare began. I spent several minutes studying the terrain, trying to orient myself and figure out which direction would take me back toward familiar country. The sun was rising in the east, which meant that home was roughly northeast from my current position. If I followed the canyon downstream, it should eventually lead me back toward the forest and the landmarks I knew. Before leaving the cave, I took one last look around the small space that had probably saved my life. The walls were covered with ancient petroglyphs, carved by people who had used this same shelter hundreds or maybe thousands of years ago. I wondered if they had ever encountered anything like what I'd experienced, if their legends contained warnings about things that hunted in the darkness. The hike home took most of the morning. The storm had transformed the landscape, washing out familiar trails and creating new channels where none had existed before. Several times I had to backtrack and find alternate routes around flash flood damage or fallen trees. But gradually the terrain began to look more familiar, and I started recognizing landmarks from my years of exploration. The forest, when I finally reached it, seemed different in the daylight. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of birds and small animals going about their daily routines. Sunlight filtered down through the canopy in familiar patterns, and the trails I knew so well were still there, though muddy and cluttered with storm debris. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Several times during the hike home, I stopped and looked back, certain that I would see that pale light flickering between the trees. It never appeared, but the sensation of being observed never completely went away. When I finally emerged from the tree line behind our house, both of my parents' cars were in the driveway, along with 2 police cruisers and what looked like half the volunteer fire department. I had been missing for almost 18 hours, and a full-scale search and rescue operation was getting underway. My parents' relief at seeing me alive was overwhelming, but so were the questions. Where had I been? What had happened to me? Why was I covered in mud and scratches? And why did I look like I'd seen a ghost? I told them about getting caught in the storm and taking shelter in a cave, which was true as far as it went, but I never mentioned the thing that had chased me through the forest, the impossible light, or the wailing that had driven me to hide like a terrified animal. Who would have believed me? Even now, more than a week later, I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I experienced that night, and I know that something in those woods had tried to hunt me down, whether it was human or animal, or something else entirely. I may never know. What I do know is that I haven't set foot in the forest since that night, and I don't plan to anytime soon. The woods that once felt like home now seem alien and threatening, full of shadows that might be hiding unspeakable things. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees, I think I can hear that wailing again, distant but unmistakable. My parents think I'm going through a phase, that the trauma of getting lost in the storm has made me temporarily afraid of the outdoors. They keep encouraging me to go hiking again, to get back on the horse and overcome my fears. But they don't understand that what I experienced wasn't just a case of getting lost or spooked by a thunderstorm. I encountered something out there in the darkness. Something that shouldn't exist but does. And until I can figure out what it was and why it was hunting me, I'm not going anywhere near those trees again. Some boundaries, once crossed, change everything. Some knowledge once gained can never be forgotten. The forest is still there, waiting just beyond my backyard. But it's not the same forest I grew up in, and I'm not the same person who used to explore it without fear. Whatever happened that night in 2018 changed both of us, and I pray to God that our paths never cross again. I've never been one for tall tales or ghost stories. At 73 years old, I've seen enough of life to know that reality is often stranger than fiction, but also that most unexplained phenomena have perfectly logical explanations, or at least that's what I used to believe. My name is Kenneth Wilson, and this is the story of something I can't explain, something that shook my beliefs to the core and changed the course of my life. It happened back in 2008, when I was working as a park ranger at Cascade Falls, Washington. Cascade Falls is one of those places that seems to exist outside of time. Nestled in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, it's a quiet reserve where nature still holds sway. Dense forests of towering Douglas firs and western red cedars create a canopy so thick that in some places, sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. The air is always thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and the sound of rushing water is a constant backdrop to the chirping of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I took the job at Cascade Falls for a couple of reasons. First, it allowed me to combine my love of nature with a decent paycheck. After a career spent mostly behind a desk, the idea of spending my days outdoors was irresistible. But if I'm being honest, there was another reason too. I've never been what you'd call a people person. Some folks thrive on social interaction, but I've always found it draining. The solitude of the ranger's life appealed to me. Out in the wilderness, I could go days without seeing another soul, and that suited me just fine. My daily routine at Cascade Falls was pretty straightforward. I'd start each morning with a cup of coffee, always black, always strong, and a review of the weather reports. Then I'd head out to maintain the trails, check on the campsite, and occasionally help out a lost hiker or two. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was satisfying. There's something deeply rewarding about being a steward of the land, about preserving these wild places for future generations. The park itself wasn't large by national standards, but it was diverse. We had everything from easy, well-maintained trails that even the most casual day tripper could handle, to rugged backcountry that would challenge even experienced hikers. The crown jewel, of course, was the falls themselves. Cascade Falls dropped over 250 feet in a series of steps, creating a spectacle that drew visitors from all over the country. I'd been working at the park for about 5 years when the incident occurred. It was early October, and the first hints of autumn were starting to show in the forest. The big leaf maples were beginning to turn, splashes of gold and red among the evergreens. The air had that crisp quality that always reminds me of new beginnings and endings all at once. I remember the day it all started as clearly as if it were yesterday. I was sitting in the ranger station, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and going over the weather reports. The forecast was calling for rain later in the week, which meant I'd need to check the trails for any potential washout areas. I was just making a mental note to pack my rain gear when the radio crackled to life. "Ken, you there?" The voice belonged to Barney Gallagher, another ranger who worked the southern part of the park. I picked up the handset. "I'm here, Barney. What's up?" "Got a situation down near the lower falls," Barney said, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Couple of teenagers set up camp in an unauthorized area. Looks like they've been here a few days. Can you come give me a hand clearing them out?" I sighed. It wasn't an uncommon problem. Despite our best efforts to educate visitors about park rules and regulations, there were always a few who thought they could do whatever they pleased. "I'm on my way," I told Barney. "Give me about 30 minutes. I grabbed my gear, tossed on my jacket, and headed out. The trek to the lower falls wasn't long, but it was a steep descent. The path wound its way down through the forest, lined on both sides by towering pines. The scent of damp earth filled the air, and the distant roar of the falls grew louder with each step. As I walked, I couldn't help but reflect on how much I loved this job, despite its occasional frustrations. There was something about being out here, surrounded by the raw beauty of nature, that never failed to lift my spirits. Even on days when I had to deal with rule breakers or careless visitors, I still felt a deep sense of gratitude for where I was and what I was doing. Barney met me at the trailhead near the lower falls. He was a good guy, Barney, a bit rough around the edges, with a booming laugh and a penchant for colorful language, but he knew the park like the back of his hand, and he cared about it as much as I did. "Glad you could make it, Ken," he said as I approached. "These kids are long gone, but they left one hell of a mess behind." We walked the rest of the way together, talking about the usual stuff, the weather, the latest football scores, and Barney's never-ending struggle with his old pickup truck. As we approached the campsite, the evidence of the teenagers' stay became clear. A small tent had collapsed, either from poor setup or the occupants' hasty departure. Trash was scattered all around. Empty beer cans, food wrappers, and other detritus that made my blood boil. It wasn't just the extra work of cleaning up after them that bothered me. It was the lack of respect for this beautiful place. "Damn kids," Barney grumbled as we started picking up the mess. "No respect these days, I tell you." I nodded in agreement, bending down to gather up some of the trash. That's when something caught my eye. Half buried under a pile of damp leaves was a small notebook. I picked it up, brushing off the debris. It was one of those cheap spiral-bound notebooks you can get at any drugstore, its cover adorned with some generic nature scene. I flipped through it quickly. Most of the pages were blank, but a few had been written in. The handwriting was messy, probably a teenager's. I stuffed it in my pocket, intending to turn it in at the Lost and Found later. It took us the better part of an hour to clean up the campsite. By the time we finished, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, painting the forest in long shadows. "Thanks for the help, Ken," Barney said as we made our way back to the trail. "I owe you a beer next time we're in town." I waved off his offer. "Don't mention it. It's part of the job, right?" We parted ways at the trailhead, Barney heading back to his sector, and me returning to the ranger station. The walk back gave me time to think. Despite the frustration of dealing with careless campers, I still felt a deep sense of peace out here in the woods. The forest had a way of putting things in perspective, of making human concerns seem small and transient in the face of nature's enduring presence. It wasn't until later that evening, after I'd returned to my small cabin on the edge of the park, that I remembered the notebook. I'd just finished a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. I've never been much of a cook, and was settling in for the night when I felt the unfamiliar bulk in my pocket. I pulled out the notebook and settled into my favorite armchair, a battered old thing that had seen better days but was still the most comfortable seat in the house. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I opened the notebook and began to read. Most of the entries were pretty typical teenage stuff. Complaints about school, drama with friends, crushes on classmates. Nothing particularly interesting or out of the ordinary. But as I flipped towards the back of the notebook, the tone of the entries began to change. October 3rd, one entry read. "We've been out here for 3 days now. It's beautiful, but there's something off. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it feels like we're being watched." I frowned, a slight chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the cabin. I read on. October 4th. "The noises at night are getting worse. Jake says it's just animals, but I'm not so sure. It doesn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. But in the shadows, I keep seeing things moving just at the edge of my vision, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there." The next entry was short, just a single line. "We need to leave. Now." I closed the notebook, my mind racing. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just the overactive imagination of a teenager alone in the woods for the first time. But something about those entries nagged at me, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. I tried to put it out of my mind as I got ready for bed. Tomorrow would be another busy day, and I needed my rest. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the wind rustling through the trees outside my window, I couldn't help but wonder what had those kids seen out there in the woods. And more importantly, was it still out there? Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The events that would unfold over the next few weeks would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and about myself. But that's a story for tomorrow. For now, I'll leave you with this thought. The world is a much stranger place than we like to admit. And sometimes the things we dismiss as imagination or superstition turn out to be all too real. The next few days passed without incident. I went about my usual routine, trying to push the unsettling contents of the notebook to the back of my mind. But every time I walked through the denser parts of the forest or heard an unfamiliar sound in the night, those ominous words would come back to me. We need to leave, now. It was on a Wednesday evening, about a week after finding the notebook, that things took a turn. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the crisp autumn air, and watching the sun set behind the trees. The radio at my side crackled to life, startling me out of my reverie. "Ken? You there?" It was Barney, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite place. I picked up the handset. "I'm here, Barney. What's going on?" There was a moment of static. Then Barney's voice came through again, shaky and uncertain.
"There's something out here, man. I don't know what it is, but it's big and it's fast. It's been following me."
I frowned. Barney wasn't one to scare easily. He'd been working these woods for over 2 decades and had encountered everything from angry bears to lost hikers. If something had him spooked, it was worth taking seriously. "Where are you?" I asked, already reaching for my jacket and boots. "Near the old logging road, past the second waterfall. Can you come out here?" "I'm on my way," I said, grabbing my flashlight and, after a moment's hesitation, my rifle. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but I wasn't taking any chances either. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The trail was barely visible, even with the flashlight, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the darkness. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me on edge, my mind conjuring images of some unseen predator stalking through the underbrush. When I finally reached the logging road, I found Barney leaning against a tree, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What happened?" I asked, scanning the area with my flashlight. Barney took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know, Ken. I was doing my usual patrol, you know. Everything was normal. Then I heard something crashing through the woods. When I turned around, I saw... He trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "What did you see, Barney?" I pressed. "It was like nothing I've ever seen before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tall, hunched over, with these eyes. God, those eyes. They glowed, Ken, like something out of a nightmare." I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering the entries in the notebook. "Did it attack you?" Barney shook his head. "No, but it felt like it was toying with me. It would disappear and then reappear closer. I thought I was losing my mind." I nodded, my grip tightening on the rifle. "Let's get you back to the station. We can figure this out in the morning." We started back, moving quickly but cautiously. I kept my eyes and ears open, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. When we reached the station, Barney collapsed into a chair, still visibly shaken. "Take it easy, Barney," I said, handing him a cup of coffee. "We'll figure this out." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept going over what Barney had said and the entries in the notebook. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and I was determined to find out what it was. The next day I decided to do a thorough patrol of the area where Barney had his encounter. I wanted to see if there were any signs of what he described. The logging road was old and overgrown, barely recognizable as a road anymore. I moved slowly, scanning the ground for tracks or any other signs of disturbance. After about an hour, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a footprint, but not like any I'd ever seen before. It was large, much larger than any human foot, and the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. I took a photo with my phone, my hand shaking slightly as I did so. A little further up, I found more footprints leading deeper into the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The forest grew denser, the trees closing in around me. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, but as I got closer, I could make out its shape. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with long limbs and a hunched posture. Its skin was a mottled gray-green, almost like tree bark, and its eyes, Barney was right. They glowed a dull yellow like dying embers. I froze, my hand tightening on the rifle. The creature stopped and turned its head towards me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. Then, with a speed that took my breath away, it vanished into the trees. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving nothing but a rustling of leaves in its wake. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what I had seen. Then, on shaky legs, I turned and headed back to the station. My mind was racing. I needed to figure out what this thing was and how to deal with it. Back at the station, I dove into research. I combed through old records, folklore, and anything I could find about creatures in the woods. One story kept coming up, the legend of the Wendigo. According to the tales, the Wendigo was a spirit that possessed people, turning them into monstrous, cannibalistic beings. But this creature didn't quite match the descriptions of a Wendigo. It was something else, something I couldn't put a name to, and that terrified me more than anything. Over the next few days, more reports came in. Hikers went missing, and campers reported strange noises and sightings. The park started to feel different, the atmosphere tense and uneasy. Barney and I doubled our patrols, but it felt like we were always one step behind. Then, one night, it all came to a head. I was out on a patrol, checking the trails near the second waterfall, when I heard a scream. It was a blood-curdling sound that sent a chill down my spine. I ran towards the source, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I found her near the edge of the waterfall, a young woman, barely conscious, her clothes torn and bloodied. I knelt beside her, checking for injuries. She had deep gashes across her chest and arms, and her breathing was shallow. "Help, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the falls. "Hang on, I'm here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, but there was no response. Static filled the airwaves, and I felt a surge of panic. I was on my own. I lifted her gently, trying to keep her calm. We started back towards the station, but every step felt like an eternity. The forest was eerily silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, there was a rustle in the bushes, and the creature emerged. It stood there, watching us, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I raised the rifle, but I knew it was useless. This thing was faster than anything I'd ever seen. "Stay back," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The creature tilted its head, almost curious, and then it lunged. I fired, but the bullet went wide. It knocked me to the ground, its claws raking across my chest. Pain exploded in my side, but I fought back, kicking and punching with everything I had. Then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, it stopped. Its eyes narrowed, and then it turned and disappeared into the trees. I lay there gasping for breath, the woman still unconscious beside me. I knew we couldn't stay there. With every ounce of strength I had left, I lifted her again and stumbled back to the station. Barney was waiting for us, his face pale with shock. "What happened?" he asked, helping me get her inside. "We need to get her to a hospital," I said, ignoring his question. "And we need to call the police. There's something out there, and it's not going to stop." The next few days were a blur. The woman, whose name I later learned was Carla, was taken to the hospital. The park was temporarily closed, and the police launched an investigation, but they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of the creature. It was as if it had never existed. Barney and I were questioned extensively, but our story sounded too unbelievable. The official report chalked it up to a bear attack, but I knew better. I had seen it, and I knew it was still out there. I decided to leave the park ranger job after that. The memories were too much, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching me, waiting for its next move. I moved to the city, where the noise and the crowds were a welcome distraction. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sound of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant roar of the waterfall, and the memory of those glowing eyes watching from the darkness. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure. It's still out there, waiting. And that's my story. Believe it or not, that's up to you. But if you ever find yourself hiking in Cascade Falls, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. In the years since that night, I've tried to make sense of what happened. I've reached out to cryptozoologists, folklorists, and even a few self-proclaimed monster hunters. Some think it might have been a previously undiscovered species, a relic from a bygone era that's managed to survive in the remote wilderness. Others suggest it could be some kind of interdimensional being, slipping between our world and another, Me? I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that my experience in those woods changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world, ancient, powerful things, that defy our understanding. I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes, and those inhuman claws. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, half expecting to see that creature looming over my bed. But as the years have passed, the fear has gradually been replaced by a sort of resigned acceptance. Whatever it was, it's part of my story now, a chapter I can't erase no matter how much I might want to. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I think I can hear the distant roar of Cascade Falls. In those moments, I'm transported back to that forest, surrounded by towering trees and hidden dangers. Part of me misses it, the wild beauty, the solitude, the sense of being part of something greater than myself. But another part of me knows that I can never go back. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. I've often wondered about Carla, the woman I found by the waterfall. I visited her in the hospital a few times before I left town. She recovered from her physical injuries, but the emotional scars ran deep. Like me, she struggled to make sense of what had happened to her. Unlike me, she didn't have the benefit of having seen the creature clearly. Her memories were a jumble of terror, pain, and confusion. The last time I saw her, just before I moved away, she told me something that stuck with me ever since. "You know, Kenneth," she said, her eyes distant, "I used to think that knowing the truth about things was always better than not knowing. But now I'm not so sure. Sometimes I think ignorance really is bliss." I've turned those words over in my mind countless times in the years since. Was she right? Would I be better off if I'd never seen what I saw in those woods? If I could still look at a forest and see only trees and wildlife, not potential hiding places for nameless horrors? I don't have an answer to that. But I do know this. Once you've glimpsed behind the curtain, once you've seen that the world is stranger and more terrifying than you ever imagined, you can't unsee it. That knowledge becomes a part of you, for better or worse. So here I am, an old man with a story that sounds too fantastic to be true. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, there are days when I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I feel a responsibility to share it, even if it's met with skepticism or outright disbelief. Because maybe, just maybe, my story will reach someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's had their own brush with the unexplained, who's been doubting their own sanity because they saw something they couldn't explain. To those people I say this: you're not alone. The world is vast and mysterious, and there are things out there beyond our understanding. Be careful out there. Keep your eyes open, your mind sharp, and your heart strong. And if you ever find yourself face to face with something that shouldn't exist, remember, surviving is its own kind of victory. As for me, I'll keep telling my story to anyone who'll listen. It's all I can do now. Bear witness to the impossible and hope that someday, somehow, it'll make a difference. Because out there in the wild places, in the shadows between the trees and the mist rising from hidden waterfalls, something is waiting, and sooner or later someone else will see it too. Until then, I'll be here, an old park ranger with a tale to tell and a warning to give. The forests are deep, the nights are long, and not everything that walks in the wilderness is as nature intended. Be safe out there, and remember, sometimes the monsters are real. It's been over 15 years since that fateful night in Cascade Falls. I'm pushing 90 now, my ranger days long behind me. I've settled into a quiet life in a small coastal town, far from the forests that once felt like home. The nightmares have mostly subsided, but the memories remain crystal clear. I've told my story countless times to friends, to researchers, even to a few documentary filmmakers. Some believe me, some don't. It doesn't matter much to me anymore. Barney passed away a few years back. Heart attack, they said. In his final days, he confided in me that he never stopped looking over his shoulder, always half expecting to see those glowing eyes in the darkness. I've kept tabs on Cascade Falls over the years. There have been more disappearances, more strange sightings. The official explanations range from animal attacks to hallucinations caused by some unidentified fungus in the area. But I know the truth. Carla and I stayed in touch. She eventually moved away too, unable to shake the feeling of being watched whenever she ventured into the woods. Last I heard, she was working as a counselor, helping others deal with traumatic experiences. As for the creature, who knows? Maybe it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of Cascade Falls. Maybe it's moved on to other hunting grounds. Or maybe, just maybe, it was some sort of guardian, protecting the wilderness from human encroachment in its own terrifying way. I don't suppose I'll ever know for sure, but that's okay. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some questions left unanswered. What I do know is this: my experience changed me, opened my eyes to a world beyond what most people see or understand. So if you find yourself in the woods someday, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. Remember that the world is stranger and more wonderful and more terrifying than we can imagine. And remember to keep your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from just beyond the firelight. This is Kenneth Wilson, signing off. Stay safe out there, and always keep one eye on the shadows. The crunch of my boots against the forest floor was the only sound that accompanied me as I hiked deeper into the Alaskan wilderness. As a seasoned park ranger, solitude was a familiar companion, but today the isolation felt heavier, almost suffocating. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves that made me pause and scan my surroundings. I had set out on this journey to investigate reports of missing hikers in the area, a task not uncommon in my line of work. However, something about these disappearances felt different, more sinister. The last known locations of the hikers were scattered and erratic, defying the usual patterns of lost travelers. As I trekked further into the dense forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself whirling around at the slightest sound, searching for any sign of movement among the towering evergreens. But there was nothing, just an eerie silence that seemed to engulf me. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I should start looking for a place to set up camp for the night, but an inexplicable sense of urgency propelled me forward. The missing hikers needed me, and every minute counted. As I pushed deeper into the wilderness, I noticed something peculiar: a faint trail of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth that led off the main path. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but years of experience had sharpened my senses. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn to the anomaly. Step by step, I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest as the forest seemed to close in around me. The once comforting sounds of nature took on an eerie quality, like whispers of warning carried on the wind. I tried to shake off the growing unease, attributing it to the isolation and the weight of my task. But as I pressed on, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was no longer alone in the vast expanse of the Alaskan wilderness. Something was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. With each step, I ventured further into the unknown, unaware of the horrors that awaited me in the heart of the forest. The trail of broken branches led me deeper into the forest, away from the well-trodden paths I was accustomed to. As I navigated the uneven terrain, I couldn't help but notice the eerie absence of animal sounds. The usual chatter of birds and rustling of small creatures had been replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to amplify every snap of a twig beneath my feet. I pressed on, driven by a mix of curiosity and duty. The trail gradually became more defined, as if something had purposefully carved a path through the dense underbrush. My eyes scanned the ground, searching for any signs of the missing hikers, but what I found instead made my blood run cold. Embedded in the soft earth were a series of tracks unlike anything I had ever encountered. They were large and elongated, with deep impressions that suggested a significant weight behind each step. But what truly unnerved me was the shape of the tracks. They seemed to shift and morph, alternating between a distorted human footprint and something decidedly more animalistic. I crouched down to examine the tracks more closely, my mind struggling to make sense of the peculiar sight. As a park ranger, I prided myself on my knowledge of the local wildlife, but these tracks defied any logical explanation. They seemed to belong to a creature that existed outside the realm of natural law. Lost in thought, I barely registered the sound of approaching footsteps until a voice called out, startling me from my reverie. I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray at my hip, only to find myself face to face with a weathered local man. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not with what's been happening lately." I straightened up, meeting his gaze with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What do you mean? Do you know something about the missing hikers? The man's eyes darted nervously around the forest before settling back on me. There are things in these woods that defy explanation, he said cryptically. Things that have been here long before us, and will remain long after we're gone. I pressed for more information, but the man simply shook his head and backed away, his gaze never leaving the strange tracks on the ground. Just be careful out there, he warned. And if you see something that doesn't belong, don't try to make sense of it. Run. With those ominous words, the man turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving me alone once more with the unsettling tracks and a growing sense of unease. As I continued my journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed to come alive around me, with shadows taking on ominous shapes and the rustling of leaves sounding like whispers of warning. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a fleeting shadow, darting between the trees with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for any animal I knew. But what truly chilled me to the core was the realization that the shadow had taken on a disturbingly human-like form, mimicking the movements of a person stalking through the undergrowth. I quickened my pace, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever was lurking in the shadows. But even as I pushed forward, I couldn't escape the growing sense of isolation and vulnerability that settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The forest, once a place of solace and beauty, had transformed into a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. And with each step, I found myself drawn deeper into its dark embrace, unaware of the horrors that awaited me in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, I realized that I had lost all sense of direction. The strange tracks and the eerie encounter with the local man had thrown me off course, and now I found myself wandering aimlessly through the dense forest. The shadows grew longer, and the once comforting sounds of the wilderness took on a sinister edge. The rustling of leaves became whispers, carried on a cold wind that seemed to penetrate straight through my layers of clothing. I strained my ears, trying to discern any familiar sounds that could guide me back to the trail, but what I heard instead made my skin crawl. Amidst the natural sounds of the forest, I caught snatches of something that sounded disturbingly human-like. Whispers and murmurs, just on the edge of comprehension, as if someone or something was tracking my every move. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkening forest for any sign of the source, but there was nothing. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to mock my growing paranoia. As I pressed deeper into the wilderness, I stumbled upon a clearing that made my blood run cold. Scattered across the forest floor were the tattered remains of a campsite, with shredded tents and abandoned gear strewn about as if a violent struggle had taken place. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously approached, my eyes searching for any clues that could shed light on the fate of the missing hikers. Amidst the chaos, I found a torn and blood-stained journal, its pages fluttering in the cold breeze. With trembling hands, I picked it up and began to read, my eyes widening with each hastily scribbled entry. The words spoke of an unseen presence stalking the hikers, a creature that defied explanation and seemed to possess an uncanny ability to mimic human voices and forms. As I delved deeper into the journal, the entries became more frantic and disjointed, the writer's mind unraveling under the weight of the horrors they had witnessed. The final entry was a chilling warning, scrawled in a shaky hand. It's not human. It's something else entirely, something ancient and hungry. If you find this, turn back now, before it's too late. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just read. The missing hikers, the strange tracks, the eerie whispers in the night. It all pointed to a truth too terrifying to comprehend. Something was out there, something that defied the laws of nature and preyed upon the unsuspecting. With a growing sense of dread, I realized that I couldn't continue my search. Not alone. Not with the darkness closing in and the unseen threat lurking in the shadows. I needed to find shelter, to regroup, and come up with a plan. But even as I set about making camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the very forest itself had become a sentient entity, waiting to swallow me whole. As I huddled around a small fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows against the trees, I tried to push down the rising tide of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm me. But with each passing moment, the whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, and the certainty that I was no longer alone in the vast expanse of the Alaskan wilderness became an inescapable truth. The night closed in around me like a suffocating blanket, the inky darkness broken only by the feeble light of my campfire. I sat huddled against a fallen log, my eyes straining against the shadows that seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. The eerie silence that had pervaded the forest during the day had given way to a symphony of unsettling sounds, the cracking of branches, the rustling of leaves, and the distant echoing whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I sat there, my mind racing with the horrifying revelations of the torn journal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. But I knew that in the darkness, with an unseen predator stalking me, running would only make me an easier target. And so I sat, paralyzed by fear, as the night wore on and the whispers grew louder. At times I could swear I heard my own name being called, the voice a twisted mockery of familiarity that sent chills down my spine. Other times the whispers took on a more insidious tone, promising safety and comfort if only I would abandon my camp and venture deeper into the forest. But I held fast, my grip on my hunting knife so tight that my knuckles turned white. I knew that the creature out there, whatever it was toying with me, trying to lure me into a trap, and so I stayed put, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, my ears straining to pick out the source of the whispers. As the hours dragged on, the paranoia began to take its toll. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my heart racing and my hand reaching for my knife. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows, but when I blinked, they were gone. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of something moving through the underbrush, something large and heavy, circling my camp like a predator stalking its prey. I caught glimpses of it in the flickering light of the campfire, a dark hulking shape that seemed to shift and change with each passing moment. I tried to calm my breathing, to steady my shaking hands as I gripped my knife tighter. But then, I heard a sound that made me freeze in terror. It was the sound of my own voice, calling out to me from the darkness, pleading for help. At first I thought I was losing my mind, that the isolation and fear had finally taken their toll, but as the voice grew louder, more insistent, I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't my imagination. The creature out there, the one that had been stalking me all night, had somehow mimicked my own voice, using it to try and lure me out of the safety of my camp. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of my own voice echoing through the night. But even as I did, I felt a creeping sense of doubt begin to take hold. What if it wasn't a trick? What if there was someone else out there, someone who needed my help? I shook my head, trying to clear the thought from my mind. I knew better than to fall for such a ruse. But as the night wore on, and the whispers grew more insistent, I could feel my resolve beginning to crumble. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I made a horrifying discovery. My supplies, which I had carefully organized and secured before settling in for the night, had been tampered with. My food had been scattered, my water bottles emptied, and my compass smashed beyond repair. It was clear that the creature had been here, in my camp, while I slept. The thought sent a wave of icy fear through my veins, and I knew that I was no longer safe, even in the light of the campfire. As I sat there, my mind reeling with the realization of just how vulnerable I truly was, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. It was a whisper, so close that I could feel the hot breath on my ear. And in that moment, I knew that the creature was there, right beside me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I bolted from my camp, my heart pounding in my chest as I crashed through the underbrush. The whispers and the feeling of hot breath on my skin propelled me forward, overriding the rational part of my brain that warned me against fleeing blindly into the night. All I knew was that I had to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the creature that had invaded my camp. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I ran, my feet pounding against the uneven forest floor. I could hear the sounds of pursuit behind me, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves as the creature gave chase. It moved with an uncanny speed and agility, seeming to flow through the darkness like a shadow given form. I risked a glance over my shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of my pursuer, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The creature had changed, its form shifting and morphing with each passing moment. One second it was a hulking bear-like beast, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. The next it had taken on a more human-like appearance, its features twisted and distorted in a way that defied comprehension. I turned my attention back to the path ahead, my lungs burning with the effort of my flight. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. The creature was faster and stronger than me, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up. But I also knew that I couldn't give up, that I had to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. As I ran, I tried to think of a plan, some way to outsmart the creature and escape its grasp. But my mind was a whirlwind of fear and panic, and every idea I had seemed to slip away as quickly as it came. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I stumbled upon something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a clearing, much like the one I had found earlier, with the remnants of a campsite scattered across the forest floor. But this one was different. The tents were intact, the gear neatly organized, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished into thin air. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was a voice, calling out from the darkness, pleading for help. But this time, it wasn't my own voice. It was the voice of one of the missing hikers, a voice I recognized from the countless hours I had spent studying their case files. For a moment I was tempted to run towards the voice, to offer aid and comfort to whoever was out there. But then I remembered the creature, the way it had mimicked my own voice to lure me out of my camp. I knew that this was just another trick, another ploy to draw me in and make me vulnerable, and so I turned and ran, leaving the clearing and the ghostly voice behind. I could feel the creature's presence all around me, its form shifting and changing as it pursued me through the dense forest. At times it took on the appearance of a massive serpentine beast, its scales gleaming in the moonlight. At others it appeared as a swarm of insects, a buzzing, chittering mass that nipped at my heels and tried to drag me down. But I refused to let it win. I pushed myself harder, faster, my muscles screaming with the effort. I could feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck, could hear its hungry growls and snarls as it closed in for the kill. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst through the tree line. I stumbled into a small clearing, my heart pounding and my lungs burning from the exertion of my flight. As I struggled to catch my breath, I took in my surroundings, desperate for any sign of shelter or safety. And there, nestled against the tree line on the far side of the clearing, I saw it, a small dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered and worn by the elements. I couldn't believe my luck. A cabin, out here in the middle of nowhere, was like a beacon of hope in the darkness. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the creature that had been pursuing me. But the clearing was empty, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the night breeze. As I drew closer to the cabin, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with the possibilities of what I might find within. But the alternative, facing the horrors of the forest alone, was too terrible to contemplate. And so, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dark and musty, the air heavy with the scent of decay and neglect. I fumbled in my pack for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I switched it on and swept the beam across the room. What I saw made my stomach turn. The cabin was a mess, with overturned furniture and shattered dishes littering the floor. But it was the personal belongings scattered throughout the space that truly chilled me to the bone. There were backpacks and hiking gear, all bearing the same logo as the missing hikers. And there, in the corner, was a pile of tattered clothing, stained with what could only be blood. As I moved deeper into the cabin, my flashlight illuminating the darkened corners, I began to piece together the grim story of what had happened here. The hikers had taken shelter in this cabin, perhaps seeking refuge from the same horrors that now stalked me. But they had not been safe here. The creature had found them, had infiltrated their sanctuary and picked them off one by one. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I imagined the terror and desperation they must have felt in their final moments. But I couldn't dwell on that now. I had to focus on my own survival, on finding a way out of this nightmare. As I searched the cabin for anything that might aid me in my escape, I stumbled upon a small leather-bound journal, tucked away in a drawer. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read, my eyes widening with each page. The journal spoke of an ancient evil that lurked in these woods. a shape-shifting entity known as a skinwalker. According to Native American legend, skinwalkers were powerful witches who could take on the form of any animal they chose, using their dark magic to hunt and torment their prey. The journal's author, one of the missing hikers, had become obsessed with the legend of the skinwalker. They had come to these woods seeking proof of its existence, hoping to capture evidence of the creature on film. But they had underestimated the skinwalker's power, and now they were paying the price. As I read on, I felt a growing sense of dread settle over me. The skinwalker was real, and it was here, in these woods, hunting me just as it had hunted the hikers. And now, trapped in this cabin, I realized that I was just as vulnerable as they had been. I set the journal down, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had just learned. I knew that I couldn't stay here, that the cabin was no longer a safe haven but a trap, waiting to be sprung. But where could I go? The forest was vast and treacherous, and the skinwalker was out there, waiting for me. As I stood there paralyzed by fear and indecision, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the creaking of the cabin door, slowly swinging open to reveal the darkness beyond. And there, silhouetted against the moonlight, was a figure, tall and slender, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. The skinwalker had found me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the figure in the doorway. The skinwalker had taken on a new form, one that was both familiar and utterly alien. It stood on two legs, its body lean and muscular, with elongated limbs that ended in wickedly sharp claws. But it was the face that truly horrified me, a twisted mashup of human and animal features, with a muzzle filled with jagged teeth and eyes that glowed with a malevolent intelligence. For a moment we simply stared at each other, the skinwalker and I, locked in a silent battle of wills. I could feel the weight of its gaze upon me, could sense the hunger and the malice that radiated from its very being, and then it spoke. "You cannot escape me," it said, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am the hunter, and you are my prey." I tried to speak, to scream, to do anything, but my voice was frozen in my throat. All I could do was watch as the skinwalker began to move, its body shifting and changing with each step. One moment it was a hulking, bear-like creature, all fur and muscle and claws. The next it was a sleek, serpentine beast, its scales glinting in the moonlight. And then it began to change again, its form morphing and twisting in ways that defied comprehension. But this time, the changes were different. The skinwalker's features began to shift and blur, taking on the appearance of someone I knew all too well, my own face. I stared in horror as the creature before me became a twisted mirror image of myself, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger. It was a psychological warfare, a tactic designed to unsettle and demoralize me, and it was working. I could feel my sanity beginning to fray at the edges, could feel the tendrils of madness creeping into my mind. How could I fight against a creature that could take on any form, that could use my own face against me? How could I hope to survive against such a formidable and terrifying adversary? But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I felt a spark of defiance flare to life in my chest. I was a survivor, a fighter, and I would not go down without a battle. I had faced dangers before, had stared death in the face and emerged victorious, and I would do so again. With a roar of fury and determination, I launched myself at the skinwalker, my hunting knife gripped tightly in my hand. The creature met my charge with a snarl of its own, its claws slashing through the air as it sought to rend and tear. We clashed in a flurry of blows and counter-blows, our bodies locked in a deadly dance of survival. I could feel the skinwalker's hot breath on my face, could smell the stench of decay and rot that emanated from its flesh, but I refused to let it win, refused to succumb to the fear and the despair that threatened to consume me. Again and again I lashed out with my knife, seeking any weak spot or vulnerability in the creature's ever-shifting form. But the skinwalker was fast and agile, its movements a blur of speed and ferocity. It seemed to anticipate my every attack, countering with a savage grace that left me battered and bleeding. But I would not yield. I had come too far, had faced too much, to let this creature claim me as its latest victim. And so I fought on, my muscles screaming with the effort, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. In the end, it was a lucky blow that saved me. My knife found a chink in the skinwalker's armor, a weak spot between its shifting forms. I drove the blade deep, feeling it sink into the creature's flesh with a sickening crunch. The skinwalker howled in pain and rage, its form shifting and writhing as it sought to escape the bite of my blade. But I held on, gritting my teeth against the agony that lanced through my own body. And then, with a final shuddering gasp, the skinwalker fell still, its body reverting to its true form. A twisted, malformed thing, neither wholly human nor wholly beast. I stood over it, my chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, hardly daring to believe that I had emerged victorious. But even as I savored my triumph, I knew that this was not the end. The skinwalker was dead, but its legacy would live on, whispered in the legends and folklore of the land. And I knew that I would never be the same, that the horrors I had witnessed would haunt me for the rest of my days. But for now, I was alive, and that was enough. I stumbled out of the cabin, my body battered and bruised, my mind reeling from the horrors I had just faced. The first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful sight, a stark contrast to the nightmare I had just endured. But even as I drank in the beauty of the sunrise, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not yet safe. The skinwalker may have been vanquished, but the forest still held its secrets, its dangers. I had to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and this cursed place as possible. I set off through the trees, my steps heavy and labored, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every fiber of my being ached with exhaustion and pain, but I pushed on, driven by a primal need to survive, to escape. As I walked, my mind began to wander, replaying the events of the past few days in vivid, terrifying detail. I saw the missing hikers, their faces etched with fear and desperation. I saw the skinwalker, its form shifting and changing, its eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. And I saw myself, fighting for my life, my sanity, my very soul. I knew that I would never be the same, that the scars I bore were not just physical, but emotional and psychological as well. The skinwalker had changed me, had forced me to confront the darkest depths of human fear and despair, and I knew that I would carry those scars with me for the rest of my life. But even as I grappled with the weight of my experiences, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, of determination. I had survived, against all odds. I had faced the skinwalker and emerged victorious. And I knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, I had the strength and the courage to overcome them. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I finally emerged from the forest, stumbling onto a dirt road that led back to civilization. I flagged down a passing car, my voice hoarse and ragged as I pleaded for help. The driver took one look at me, at my torn and bloodied clothes, my haunted eyes, and knew that something terrible had happened. They called for help, for medical attention, for the authorities. And as I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief, I knew that my ordeal was finally over. I had made it out alive, had escaped the clutches of the skinwalker and the horrors of the forest. But even as I savored my victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The skinwalker may have been defeated, but there were other horrors out there, other nightmares waiting to be unleashed. And I knew that, as long as I lived, I would never be truly free of the skinwalker's legacy. Its memory would haunt me, would lurk in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. But for now, I was safe. I had survived, had emerged from the darkness and into the light, and that, in itself, was a kind of triumph. As I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, I whispered a silent prayer of thanks. I had been tested, had been pushed to the very limits of my endurance and sanity, but I had not broken. I was a survivor, and that was enough. As I zipped up my backpack filled with enough supplies for a week-long camping trip in the Navajo Nation's rugged backcountry, I couldn't shake the feeling that this excursion would be different from any I'd experienced before. My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to the untamed wilderness, seeking solace in nature's embrace. But this time, something in the air felt charged, electric with anticipation, or perhaps, warning. The Navajo Reservation sprawled across the Four Corners region, a vast expanse of red rock canyons, pine-forested mountains, and sacred lands steeped in ancient lore. I had obtained the necessary permits and studied the approved hiking routes, determined to respect the land and its people. Yet, as I shouldered my pack and locked my car at the trailhead, a chill ran down my spine despite the warm autumn sun. I set off down the well-worn path, boots crunching on gravel and pine needles. The scent of sage and juniper filled my nostrils, and the distant cry of a hawk echoed through the canyons. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, the modern world fell away, replaced by a landscape that seemed unchanged for millennia. By late afternoon, I'd covered several miles, and decided to make camp in a small clearing nestled between towering ponderosa pines. As I set up my tent and gathered firewood, the shadows lengthened, and an eerie stillness settled over the forest. The usual chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves had gone quiet, as if the very land was holding its breath. I cooked a simple meal over my campfire, watching as the flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. As night fell, a sliver of moon rose, bathing the landscape in pale, silvery light. I should have felt at peace, but instead, unease gnawed at the pit of my stomach. Just as I was about to retreat to my tent, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. I froze, straining my ears. Another crack, closer this time. My heart began to race as I peered into the gloom, searching for the source of the sound. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the firelight, too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. They blinked once and vanished. I scrambled into my tent, zipping it shut as if the thin nylon could offer any real protection. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and the supernatural forces that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge after a restless night. The forest seemed normal in the light of day, birds chirping and small animals scurrying about their business. I tried to convince myself that the eyes I'd seen were just a figment of my imagination, a trick of shadow and firelight. As I broke camp and continued my hike, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that flickered at the corner of my vision, set my nerves on edge. I pressed on, following the trail as it wound through a narrow canyon, red rock walls towering on either side. Midday found me resting beside a small stream, refilling my water bottles and stretching my tired muscles. As I sat on a sun-warmed boulder, letting the gentle burble of the water soothe my frayed nerves, an old man appeared on the path. He was clearly Navajo, his weathered face etched with the lines of a long life, his long silver hair tied back in a neat braid. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said without preamble, his dark eyes studying me intently. I started, surprised by his sudden appearance. "I have a permit," I replied defensively. "I'm following all the guidelines for backcountry hiking." The old man shook his head slowly. "Some things can't be permitted. Some trails shouldn't be walked by outsiders." He paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Have you seen anything unusual?" I hesitated, then found myself telling him about the eyes I'd glimpsed the night before. As I spoke, the old man's expression grew grave. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You've entered a place between worlds, where the veil is thin. There are creatures here, ancient and powerful, that don't take kindly to trespassers." "What kind of creatures?" I asked, a chill creeping up my spine despite the warm sun. The old man's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a mixture of fear and resignation. "We call them Yinal Blushi, skinwalkers. They are witches who have forsaken their humanity, taking on the forms of animals to work their evil." I wanted to scoff, to dismiss his words as superstition, but the memory of those gleaming eyes in the darkness held my tongue. "How can I protect myself?" I asked instead. The old man reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object, a hand-carved fetish in the shape of a wolf, strung on a leather cord. "Wear this," he said, pressing it into my hand. "It may offer some protection, but the surest safety lies in leaving this place. Turn back while you still can." Before I could reply, he turned and walked away, disappearing around a bend in the canyon as suddenly as he had appeared. I stared at the fetish in my hand, its weight seeming far greater than its size would suggest. As I resumed my hike, the old man's warnings echoed in my mind. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss them as the ramblings of a superstitious elder, but a deeper instinct urged caution. I slipped the fetish around my neck, its presence both comforting and ominous. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. But as twilight approached and I made camp for the second night, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew longer, darker, and more menacing. As I huddled by my small fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the darkness, watching, waiting. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with disjointed nightmares. Flashes of teeth and claws, inhuman howls, and always, always those gleaming eyes boring into my soul. I awoke with a start, heart pounding, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool night air. Something had pulled me from my uneasy slumber, a sound barely perceptible but undeniably real. I lay still in my sleeping bag, ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, a soft scraping, like claws on bark, coming from just outside my tent. My fingers clutched the wolf fetish around my neck as I held my breath, willing whatever was out there to move on. A shadow fell across the tent wall, backlit by the dying embers of my fire. It was distinctly humanoid in shape, but too tall, too lean to be a normal person. As I watched in paralyzed horror, the shadow seemed to elongate, twisting into something no longer recognizably human. A low growl rumbled through the night, so deep I felt it in my bones rather than heard it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The scraping sounds receded, fading into the distance until all I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I didn't sleep again that night. As soon as the first gray light of dawn seeped through the trees, I emerged from my tent on shaky legs. The campsite looked undisturbed, but as I circled the perimeter, I froze in my tracks. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint, if you could call it that. It was elongated, with sharp claw marks at the ends of distorted toes. It looked like a bizarre fusion of human and animal, too large for a wolf or coyote, but no human foot could have made that impression. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Could it be a bear? A mountain lion? But I knew in my gut that this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in the natural world. As I stared at the track, the old man's words came back to me. Ye Naldloshi, skinwalkers. I shuddered, the weight of the fetish around my neck suddenly oppressive. I broke camp in record time, my earlier plans of a leisurely week-long trek forgotten. All I wanted now was to get back to civilization, back to a world where monsters existed only in stories and on screens. But as I shouldered my pack and consulted my map, my heart sank. The quickest route back to my car was still a 2-day hike through increasingly rugged terrain. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves. I could do this. I had to do this. I set off at a brisk pace, constantly scanning my surroundings. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. By midday, my nerves were frayed, and my muscles ached from the constant tension. As I paused to rest and eat a quick lunch, movement caught my eye. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by a stand of junipers, stood a coyote. But something was off. Its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its posture too erect. As I stared, it turned its head and met my gaze. Those eyes, they were the same ones I'd seen that first night, glowing in the firelight. They weren't the eyes of an animal, but something ancient, intelligent, and malevolent. A sound escaped its mouth, not the yip of a coyote, but a low, guttural laugh that was terrifyingly human. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning my half-eaten lunch, and ran. I crashed through underbrush, leapt over fallen logs, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, finally collapsing against a boulder, gasping for air. As my breathing slowed and my panic subsided, I realized I had a bigger problem. In my blind flight, I'd veered off the trail. I was lost in the wilderness, with dusk approaching and something inhuman on my trail. I pulled out my map and compass with shaking hands, trying to get my bearings. But as the shadows lengthened and an unnatural mist began to creep through the trees, I knew that this night would be a fight for survival, and quite possibly for my very soul. As twilight deepened into true night, an unnatural fog rolled through the forest, thick and cloying. It seemed to absorb sound and light, leaving me in a muffled gray world where distances became deceptive and familiar landmarks disappeared into the gloom. I had managed to find a small cave in the side of a rocky outcropping. Not much more than a shallow indent, really, but it felt safer than being fully exposed. I huddled there, my back pressed against the cold stone, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of pursuit. The mist swirled and eddied, taking on shapes that seemed almost deliberate, reaching tendrils, grasping claws, leering faces that formed and dissolved in the blink of an eye. I told myself it was just my frightened imagination playing tricks, but a deeper part of me knew better. This fog wasn't natural. It was a hunting ground, a veil between worlds where the skinwalker held sway. As if summoned by my thoughts, a howl pierced the night, a sound that started as a wolf's cry but twisted mid-note into something terrifyingly human. It was close, much too close. I pressed myself further into the meager shelter of the cave, one hand clutching the wolf fetish, the other wrapped around the handle of my hunting knife. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Through the mist, a figure began to take shape. At first it looked like a man, tall and lean. But as it drew closer, its form seemed to shimmer and shift. One moment it was bipedal, the next it moved on all fours. Its proportions changed with each step. Limbs elongating, spine twisting, head reshaping itself from human to animal and back again. I held my breath, hoping against hope that it would pass me by. The figure paused, lifting its head to scent the air. Slowly it turned toward my hiding place. Through the fog, I caught a glimpse of its face, a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an inner fire. It spoke then, in a voice that grated like stone on stone. "I smell your fear, little one. You don't belong here. This is my domain, my hunting ground. Did you think that trinket would protect you?" I clutched the fetish tighter, my voice barely a whisper as I replied, "What do you want from me?" The creature's mouth stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Want? I want what all predators want, the thrill of the chase, the taste of terror, the satisfaction of a successful hunt." It took a step closer, its form rippling and changing.
But you're different. I sense power in you, untapped potential. You could join us, you know. Shed your frail human form, embrace the night, become something more.
For a moment, just a moment, I felt a pull, a seductive whisper of power and freedom. But then I thought of home, of my family and friends, of the life I'd left behind. I gripped the fetish so hard its edges bit into my palm. "Never," I spat, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. The skinwalker's eyes narrowed, and a low growl rumbled from its chest. "Then you've chosen to remain prey. Run, little one. Run as fast and as far as you can. It will make the hunt all the sweeter." With that it melted back into the mist, its laughter echoing through the trees. I remained frozen in place for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. But as the eastern sky began to lighten, I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to find my way back to the trail and ultimately to safety. As I cautiously emerged from my shelter, the mist began to dissipate, revealing a landscape transformed by night. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of the skinwalker's presence, claw marks on trees, tufts of fur that were neither fully animal nor human, tracks that shifted from paw prints to footprints and back again. I consulted my map and compass, plotted what I hoped was a course back to the main trail, and set off. But with each step I knew the skinwalker was out there, watching, waiting for night to fall again. And I knew that when darkness came, the real hunt would begin. As I pushed on through the day, trying to make up for lost time and find my way back to the marked trail, the weight of history and myth seemed to press in around me. Every rock formation, every ancient tree felt imbued with significance I couldn't quite grasp. Exhaustion and fear had heightened my senses to a fever pitch. Colors seemed more vivid, scents more potent, and as I walked I began to hear whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind through the leaves or my own ragged breathing, but gradually the whispers coalesced into words, fragments of stories, warnings, laments. They spoke of ancient wars between tribes, of dark magic and terrible sacrifices. They told of the first skinwalkers, medicine men, and women who had twisted their healing arts to serve their own selfish ends, trading their humanity for power. I heard tales of entire villages wiped out in a single night, of children stolen from their beds, of a darkness that had haunted these lands for centuries. As the whispers grew louder, The landscape around me seemed to shift and change. One moment I was walking through the forest as it was. The next I was surrounded by the ghostly images of a past long gone. I saw native warriors locked in battle, their war cries echoing across time. I witnessed secret ceremonies in hidden caves, where aspiring skinwalkers performed unspeakable rites to gain their powers. Through it all, one name kept repeating, growing louder until it drowned out all other sounds. Nahukoji Hastian, man who devours the stars. The visions crescendoed, and suddenly I found myself in the midst of a nightmarish scene. A village was burning, its inhabitants fleeing in terror as a monstrous figure loped between the flames. It was larger than any skinwalker I'd seen or imagined, its form a horrifying amalgamation of wolf, bear, and man. Its eyes blazed with an unholy fire as it snatched up fleeing villagers, consuming them whole. As quickly as it had appeared, the vision faded, leaving me gasping and disoriented. I stumbled, nearly falling, and found myself face to face with a weathered petroglyph carved into a red rock wall. The crude figure depicted matched the monster from my vision, Nahukoji Hastian, the most powerful and terrifying skinwalker of all. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. I wasn't just being hunted by any skinwalker. I had stumbled into the territory of a legendary evil, a creature that had terrorized these lands for untold generations. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I redoubled my efforts to find the trail. The whispers faded, but the knowledge they had imparted weighed heavily on me. I was no longer just fighting for my own survival, but carrying the echoes of countless victims before me. Their stories, their warnings, their pain, all of it fueled my determination to survive and somehow put an end to this ancient evil. As night fell once more, I knew I couldn't keep running. The skinwalker Nahukoji Hastian would never stop hunting me, and even if I managed to escape, how many more innocent lives would be lost to this monster? The whispers of the past had awakened something in me, a sense of responsibility I couldn't ignore. I found a defensible position, a small plateau with a clear view of the surrounding area. Instead of hiding, I built a fire, larger than was wise, a blazing beacon in the darkness. Then I sat, the wolf fetish in one hand, my knife in the other, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The mist rolled in once more, but this time I was ready for it. I focused on the fetish, remembering the old man's words, drawing strength from the generations of Navajo who had fought against this evil before me. A howl split the night, closer than ever before. I stood, facing the direction of the sound. "I'm here," I shouted into the darkness. "Come and face me, Nahukoji Hastian. I'm not running anymore." The mist parted, and there it stood, the monster from my vision, even more terrifying in reality. It towered over me, its massive form rippling with barely contained power, its eyes fixed on me, burning with hunger and hatred. "Brave little morsel," it growled, its voice like grinding boulders. "Do you think you can stand against me? Countless warriors have tried. Their bones litter my domain." I stood my ground, fear warring with determination. Maybe they stood alone, but I carry their stories, their strength. I won't let their sacrifices be in vain. The skinwalker laughed, a sound that shook the very ground. "Pretty words. Let's see if they protect you from my claws and teeth." It lunged, faster than anything that size should move. But somehow, I was faster. I dodged, the fetish in my hand growing warm. Was it my imagination, or was it glowing faintly? We danced a deadly dance, the skinwalker's massive form twisting and changing as it attacked. One moment it had the head of a wolf, the next a bear's crushing paws. I dodged and weaved, the fetish growing hotter in my hand, seeming to guide my movements. As we fought, I began to understand. The skinwalker's power came from fear, the fear of its victims, the fear it had instilled in these lands for generations. And while I was terrified, I was no longer letting that fear control me. "Your time is over, Nahukoji Hastian," I shouted, my voice stronger than I felt. "These lands don't belong to you anymore." The skinwalker roared in fury, lunging at me with renewed ferocity. But in its anger, it grew careless. I saw an opening and took it, driving my knife deep into its side. The creature howled in pain and rage. Black, oily blood seeped from the wound. It staggered back, its form flickering like a bad transmission. "This isn't over," it snarled. "I am eternal. I am the night itself." But I could see the truth in its eyes. For the first time in centuries, Nahuk-Chi Hastine knew fear. Before I could press my advantage, the skinwalker melted into the mist, its howls fading into the distance. I stood there breathing hard, hardly believing I had survived. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit me like a truck. I barely managed to rekindle my fire before collapsing beside it, slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep. I awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. For a moment I lay there disoriented, the events of the night before feeling like a distant nightmare, but the ache in my muscles and the dried blood on my knife told a different story. As I sat up, wincing at my various scrapes and bruises, I noticed something had changed. The air felt lighter, cleaner somehow. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the forest was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of birds and small animals going about their morning routines. I broke camp quickly, eager to find my way back to civilization. As I hiked, I remained alert, half expecting the skinwalker to launch another attack. But the day passed uneventfully, the beauty of the wilderness slowly working its way back into my awareness. By mid-afternoon, I finally spotted a familiar landmark, a distinctive rock formation I recognized from my map. I was back on the main trail and not far from the trailhead where I'd left my car. As I rounded a bend in the path, I nearly ran into someone coming the other way. It was the old Navajo man who had given me the fetish. He smiled at me, but it was a smile tinged with sadness and something else. Respect, perhaps. "You faced him," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, suddenly at a loss for words. How could I possibly explain what had happened? The old man's eyes crinkled at the corners. "You did well. Nahuk-Chi Hastine's power is broken, at least for now. It will be many years before he troubles these lands again." "But I didn't kill it," I protested. "It got away." "Some evils can't be killed, only pushed back," the old man replied. "What matters is that you stood against the darkness. You reminded it that there are still those who will fight." He reached out, gently taking the wolf fetish from around my neck. "This has served its purpose. I'll see that it's properly honored." As he turned to go, I called out, "Wait, who are you? How did you know about all this?" The old man paused, looking back at me with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient and unfathomably deep. "I am a guardian, one of many. We watch. We wait. We prepare others to face the darkness when it rises." His form shimmered slightly, reminding me of the skinwalker's transformations, but without the sense of wrongness. "Safe journey, brave one. And should you ever return to these lands, know that you walk among friends." With that, he disappeared around a bend in the trail. When I hurried after him, there was no sign of his passing. The final miles back to my car passed in a daze. My encounter with the skinwalker, the visions of the past, the mysterious old man. It all swirled in my mind, too fantastical to be real, yet impossible to dismiss. As I drove away from the Navajo lands, heading back toward the familiar comforts of home, I found myself grappling with everything I'd experienced. How could I possibly explain it to anyone? Who would believe me? But as the miles rolled by, I realized that maybe I didn't need anyone else to believe. I knew what had happened. I had faced an ancient evil, and against all odds, I had survived. More than that, I had struck a blow against a darkness that had plagued these lands for generations. The experience had changed me, opened my eyes to a world beyond the one I thought I knew. I found myself looking at the landscape differently, wondering what other secrets it held, what other guardians watched from the shadows. As I neared home, I made a decision. I would return someday, better prepared, with a deeper understanding of the lore and history of these lands. The skinwalker was wounded but not destroyed, and if it ever rose again, I wanted to be ready. For now, though, I longed for the comfort of familiar surroundings. As I pulled into my driveway, the first stars appearing in the twilight sky, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I had walked in two worlds and returned to tell the tale. I knew that my nights would be haunted for some time to come, filled with dreams of mist-shrouded forests and gleaming eyes in the darkness. But I also knew that I was stronger for having faced my fears, for having stood against an evil most could never imagine. As I unlocked my front door, I paused. looking back at the distant silhouette of mountains on the horizon. Until we meet again, I whispered to the wind, to the ancient lands, to the guardians who walked unseen. Then I stepped inside, closing the door on one chapter of my life and opening another. The world was bigger, stranger, and more wondrous than I had ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the wild places where few dare to tread, the eternal dance between light and darkness continued, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to join in.